Welcome to the C Word, the Conservators podcast. Today we're talking about contemporary art. I'm Jenny Mathiasson, an objects conservator based in South Yorkshire.
I'm Kloe Ramsey, an objects conservator based in Greater Manchester.
And I'm Christina Rizek, an objects conservator based in Cambridgeshire.
Welcome to the show,
Hello.
everyone. And today we are joined by special guest host, Sarah. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Sarah Potter. I'm an objects conservator based in Greater Manchester, and I work in an art gallery and predominantly with contemporary art.
Right, so should we try to come up with a definition of what contemporary art is, just so we're on the same page?
I've got a list of essentially problems that I feel like define how some areas of contemporary art differ from, say, what we would consider a normal collection.
Okay, yeah, sure.
And
like any collection is ever normal.
I know. But I think the thing that I'm interested in particularly is the ethical side of things. So I'm really interested to talk to you, Sarah, about things surrounding that. With living or not living artists, I don't really mind. No, that sounds awful. I don't mind if they're dead.
Yeah. It's an absolute minefield. Well, especially with living artists, because they always have such ownership over an artwork. Even if an art gallery technically own the artwork, the artist will always have an intrinsic say in how the artwork lives or develops within the art institute, either through conservation treatments and repairs and how it's displayed. So you can do all the documentation that you want when you acquire a work, but essentially a lot of the time the living artists will always want to say. And that is on the ethical level of who has ownership of an artwork once you've paid for the art.
I mean, on the topic of they can be dead or alive is, kind of the time span that we're talking about. How do we define contemporary? What does contemporary mean? Obviously, contemporary tends to mean present day, but it spans further back into time than that. So contemporary art...
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen various definitions, like I've seen people who argue that contemporary means from the 1950s onwards, sometimes Second World War onwards. And I've seen various definitions floating about. How do we feel about what time scale is contemporary?
I'd always say that contemporary is from the 1960s onwards, and that modern art is from like the period of the war. So you're looking at like the difference between modern art and then contemporary art. Very different things. That's what I think.
And is that based on whether or not the artist could be alive, or the artist's sort of extended family could be alive, or is that more just the kind of things that people were doing?
I don't know, or is it a change in techniques and technology and the materials available to different artists and the shift in that aspect of time rather than if they're alive or dead? Is it due to the technology?
I mean, that's a really interesting aspect, isn't it? Because, people can paint with oil colours today, but that's a traditional medium, but that would still be contemporary art. So, we tend to define things by time frame, but it's more interesting if we're starting to talk about techniques or the availability of different art materials. Layman's terms, like people do conflate modern and contemporary art, but that's not really what we're trying to do here. We're kind of trying to separate them out a little bit. We're trying to crowbar in there and go, actually modern art means something and contemporary art means something else. But
obviously with the term contemporary art, there's two parts of it as well, and the other part of that is the art bit, and where you draw the line between contemporary art and other kinds of contemporary artefacts that might be in museums for other reasons, and what the difference is between contemporary art and other kinds of contemporary artefacts.
Oh, we're getting meta now.
I didn't anticipate that we'd be
down the rabbit hole already.
I know, sorry to...
You're just asking what is art here.
I mean, I suspect one of the differences is the authorship, the fact that there is a named artist and that artist still maintains, as Sarah said, some kind of relationship with the artwork even after it's been accessioned, which isn't the case for things that are just artifacts, if you like.
Ooh.
And another difference would be that art is something that is meant to be appreciated just for its aesthetic qualities.
Oh, I see. So it's not something that's useful.
Potentially be treated differently. Yeah. Oh. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, these are interesting things, because immediately I started thinking things like, Yes, but what about fashion designers? They are associated with like things that are very much created, usually in factories, in fact, but it has their name and their branding. And you could argue that there's a relationship there in terms of that person being linked to that garment. You know, oh God.
Or design more generally, actually, where you've got very significant pieces of, say, furniture.
But I suppose then we're into the territory of it being useful as well as...
So art is so our working definition is stuff that's useless from the 1960s onwards.
So, Sarah, what do you think of that as or the things that we've just said based on your knowledge of what you have in your collection and what you've seen in other people's similar collections?
Well, I know our director wouldn't like to hear people say art's useless. That's very much against his current philosophy and thinking, and he's trying to think of ways to make art very useful.
Let's just go with it's a definition in progress, but that's fine. Right, so our experiences around the table of contemporary art then, what would that be? What does it look like for you, Kloe?
So for me, well, I've mentioned on the podcast before that both my parents are artists.
Yes.
But I feel like I could say so much about that. I could complain about working with artists so much just on a personal family level that I just won't even go into it. Don't use all these materials, Mum. No, put that foam away. The experience that I've had in my current role working with artists has been very much secondary. So our the person who plans the exhibitions officer, is the primary person who discusses with artists, and they tend to be quite new artists and radical artists as well. So my experience with it is that they are not part of the collection, so I don't have jurisdiction over their care.
Okay, so more like loans.
They are loans, but they're not treated like loans because it's a less formal relationship with the museum.
Okay.
So from a official point of view and the so how do I care for this situation, I find that really difficult because, you know, you're talking to an artist who wants people to touch things, wants people to interact with them, you know, sometimes likes the idea of people being able to change stuff. And that's at the moment that's my main experience with working with contemporary art and contemporary artists, because they are often installation pieces. And recently I have had to cover an object that the artist previously wanted to have touchable, but then people started to break it because obviously that's you know, that's museums sometimes.
Sometimes, yes.
So it's the changing idea that working with artists are supposed to communicate the difference between displaying something in an art gallery where people are very much less likely, I feel, to handle stuff than in a museum where we have interactives and things that people can handle, sort of communicating the difference between those two things and the potential harm that could be caused. So that's my really long-winded try not to rant about it. Okay,
so my experiences are more limited in that we have a couple of contemporary pieces where I work now, but I've not really worked very much with certainly not in an interventive way. I've, you know, condition checked like generally preventative stuff for contemporary art in usually sculpture, for example, sometimes two-dimensional things. Sometimes we've had an installation piece on loan, like we've got a long-term loan now of an artwork that's a light box and that sort of thing. So like my experience is quite limited. That being said, the museum I work at is actually in a park, and there's quite a lot of kind of outside artwork going on because there's like a close relationship with a charity that does a lot of art workshops and all that stuff, quite community-based really. And some of that is completely made to be outside and decay. Sometimes it's spray paint on plastic wrap, you know, like that's like between two trees. Like the preservation there is to take a photo of it and remember it, and it's not really to like take the plastic down and try to look after it. So in a way that's an installation piece that's not really meant to be conserved because but then it doesn't belong to us. It kind of belongs to the community and and in some ways I guess the park or like the people who visit the park. It's not really ours. It's not a museum piece as such. So I can see the kind of informal relationship there. Maybe it's of a similar nature where it's like a
But then do people... Sorry, this is off topic. Well, not off topic. It's off the circle discussion.
Okay.
Do people
tangent.
then take the bits of that, the remains of that artwork down and hand it to you and say, can you look after this, please?
That's not
hasn't
happened yet.
Okay. Okay.
That's a fun thing. I'm sure that will come up in the future, but it hasn't happened yet, which
Right.
I'm happy with. Yeah, so my experience is relatively limited, mostly loans, condition checking, and preventative care. Not really anything interventive at all. Certainly not packing away or reinstalling and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
It's been pretty straightforward from my point of view. How about you, Christina?
Like a lot of object conservators, I guess, apart from Sarah, my experience is quite limited. And funnily enough, the experiences I have had of contemporary art have all been through ethnographic collections. And I think that's partly because museums that have those kinds of collections often collect things by living artists from particular communities, and those things are often three-dimensional and therefore come to the objects conservator.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking about things like pieces of contemporary Inuit sculpture, which we had in a museum that I worked in previously. And more recently, I've worked in a museum which commissioned an artwork which is a sort of installation, so it doesn't exist at the moment, it's kind of disassembled but can be recreated, and it's an installation by a contemporary Maori artist that takes a teko teko, which is a Maori carved human figure out of wood, which is already in the collection, and then adds this whole sort of audio artwork around it as well.
Oh.
And so the artwork consists of this figure and a pair of 1970s headphones.
Love it.
Absolutely massive plastic and kind of metal wire headphones. I'm not quite sure where she sourced them, but there you go. And so, apart from the artwork itself gets set up by the technicians in the museum, that's nothing to do with the conservators as such, but my intervention was basically putting bits of Melodex between the earphone pads and the actual sculpture in the collection as well. And that's partly because although these headphones are not strictly part of our collection, they're part of the artwork. And so, we found ourselves having to care for those in the same way, even though I'm not sure if they're actually accessioned objects or not. But they're sort of certainly part of something that can be used with an object that is definitely already in the collection to create a contemporary audio artwork.
Oh, that's so interesting.
But apart from that, very, very little.
Sarah, what about you?
So I'd say the majority of my time at the moment is actually spent doing installation art, and predominantly a lot of loans come in, but we do have quite a lot of within our collection that needs either treatment, so we do quite a bit of treatment on some of our objects that are very contemporary. So we have quite a large collection of artwork by outsider artists. So these are artists who haven't traditionally been trained or taught in art colleges and art schools, and they use a lot of unusual materials, or really materials that can be found around the house. So some of these sculptures contained bread and chewing gum, dust and hair, latex, plastics, lots of lovely materials like that become quite challenging. And you think, oh gosh. So there's always so much to learn and so much to read, especially within conservation. A lot of that material isn't really studied or learnt about, so you end up doing quite a bit of research around these materials and understanding them, and then trying to figure out what's the best way to treat them where possible. We do have some collections where the artists still are very much involved in the treatment process, and they want to kind of sign off on the final treatments that you actually do to the artwork. And some artworks, they won't actually let you treat themselves. I want you to send them back to the studios, and the studio will treat the objects even though they belong to us. So they still have very much an ownership over those artwork, even though technically the gallery own them. So that's quite an interesting aspect to some of the works that we have. And then, as I say, during quite a lot of our installation works, we change over our gallery spaces quite regularly. So we have quite a lot of loans in, with a lot of contemporary pieces as well. So this can be from media, so digital artwork, so lots of video installation and audio, to a full-on installation artworks. At the moment we actually own a 6 metre by 6 metre latex sheet. So I was installing that last week, which was quite interesting.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, so it's called The Ethics of Dust, and it's by Jose Otto Polios. He's a Spanish artist who used the conservation technique of pulling latex off a brick wall as a poultice to remove the dust behind it. And so then he hangs this latex sheet, or we suspend it in the air and shine light, and then it becomes the artwork of all this removed dust, this building material that then once belonged on this brickwork, and what belonged and was part of the wall for so many years and then becomes the artworks. It's all, so there's quite a lot of interesting work, and you're always learning, which is fantastic with contemporary art, because all of these unusual materials that you just never knew could be made into art.
So, Sarah,
that's really cool.
You said you described yourself as an objects conservator.
Yes.
How did you end up conserving contemporary art?
So I started originally as an objects conservator in a museum, and then I've slowly migrated towards an art gallery, and they have quite a large collection of traditional artwork as well. So, marble sculpture, bronze works, and then I'd say so half of the collection is contemporary, half the collection is quite traditional. So it's just the way that the gallery's progressed over time and the way that we've acquired works. It's just become more and more contemporary works because they're still acquiring and collecting now.
This reminds me, do you remember that a couple of episodes ago I joked that I should audio test sanitary products because of an artwork that you'd encountered?
Yes.
It just makes me think of that, like who's done research on this, and sometimes you have to do really weird research. And sometimes you have to do it yourself, which is like one of those very odd things. But there must also be really enjoyable working with contemporary art. Like just this really weird stuff, like you end up just researching, okay, what's in crayons? And
absolutely,
what's photocopying paper actually like, and what's the longevity of it? All this crazy stuff that I actually think is really fun. And I bet someone out there has done something on, but you might have to dig in unexpected places.
Well, what I'd like to see, so with most of us who have dealt with exhibition installs, will be aware of the British Museum Oddie Test spreadsheet of tested paints that are okay. I feel like we need a version of that, a crowdsourced version of that, but for anything you can think of, like, and if polyester carpet and sanitary products and crayons and like everything.
And if that already exists, please tell me.
But except the difference there is that you're looking at materials that might be used for temporary or permanent display. And actually what you're talking about, Sarah, is materials that are part of the artwork itself. Yeah. So you can't substitute it with a better type of bread or sanitary towel or whatever. It's...
Well, I think that's true, but you can anticipate problems. You can anticipate problems that might be caused by one part of the object to another part of the object. And I say that as a route to a solution, mainly because I feel like doing accelerated aging tests of everything around us might be really difficult to manage. But I imagine people haven't done, maybe they have done accelerated aging tests on sanitary products.
But maybe that's the issue with all these transient materials that the artists are using, that we just don't know the longevity and how they're going to react or live in the future. And maybe that's a question of like when things then become replicas and things get swapped out, especially with a lot of the larger installation art pieces where you've got multiple objects. Sometimes it's the documentation that holds together the installation rather than the actual physical object themselves. So it's like, what is the artwork? Is it the concept of the artwork, or is it the actual physicality of the artwork? And it's kind of like getting down to, the meaning of the artwork in itself. And if it's not going to last, is it okay then to acknowledge that the latex sheet that we installed, we know that's not going to last forever. In 100 years' time, it won't be with us. And as conservators, maybe it's just about documenting it now and not trying to preserve things forever. I don't know how we can keep everything alive forever when it obviously is not meant to.
Sarah, do you have conversations with the artists that you're in contact with about how durable the materials they're using are likely to be? And is that something they're interested in? Do they care? Do you find that some of them actually want things to decay?
Yeah, so some of them, we've talked to some artists and they've changed the types of materials they've used. So obviously some of the artwork that they've given us, we can't do anything about now, but it's changed processes, and that they're going to start making they're changing their ways they're looking at in the future. But also at the same time, we find a lot of artists change their minds about what the artwork means and represents. So we have some outside sculpture, and one of those pieces, it was supposed to deteriorate and over time, and the artist was very happy with that. And then all of a sudden they changed their mind and decided, actually, no, it shouldn't deteriorate. I want you to replace aspects of it over time, and it always needs to look in a certain way. So it's not just even about the materials and how they change. It's actually the artists and how they decide that the artwork's going to change. It's really, it's just unusual.
That sounds like a total minefield, because we're used, I think maybe as conservators, we're used to the idea of It is accessioned. It is now under our care. And we put on the gloves and the coat and we go, excellent, now we can use acid-free everything and it's all under our control. But it sounds like, especially if you're still fostering relationships with the artists as an institution, it sounds like you've got constantly changing goalposts in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so as a role for the conservator, do we then just become like the mediators between the institute and the artists and trying to make them understand what we want or what is needed, or, you know, trying to understand a way forward for the artwork? I don't know. Like, does our role change depending on the contemporary art and the artists?
So I feel like I've just got challenges written in really big letters on my notebook. And I feel like I'm always the one that goes, yeah, well, this is really hard, isn't it? Isn't this really hard? And I don't want to sound really negative. But do you find that an aspect of your role is actually communicating the goals of conservation to artists and to other members of the art gallery?
Well, we do try and get as much documentation as possible from the artists, even just down to the actual materials and the techniques they've used. That's kind of the basics. But we always quite like to know, when we acquire pieces, the exact standards of how they want to display things, how they want it to be visually impactful. So it's not just a case of saying one object. It'll be how the room looks, the paint colour on the walls, you know, everything down to the tiny details of how they actually want the pieces to work. So it's not just a conservation job, it's the curatorial jobs, it's all the technicians. It's kind of like very much the institute needs all this information and it all needs to be documented to get that idea.
I've written down question need for conservator, and I think what I meant by that is I wonder if a lot of people question whether these things need conservation at all, partly because they use often ephemeral materials, they're modern. I think a lot of people would think, well, okay, so if something uses, I don't know, marigold rubber gloves or a piece of bread or something like that, and something happens to it, can't you just replace it with another bit? Do you need a conservator? Do we actually even need to be conserving these things? And I just wondered if that was an attitude you'd encountered, Sarah.
I don't think I have encountered that attitude, but I can see where you're coming from. I know that, yeah, if we can't conserve it, then do we need it? And then do we need a conservator in the first place? I think it's always nice to be needed.
Well, we always need, whatever it is, even if you were working with a collection of just concept art that didn't have any, accessories, I guess, there would always be the need for somebody to make that decision and to, I suppose, take the responsibility of the condition of the artwork on. So it may also be the person who replaces the rubber gloves, because at the end of the day, an artist will always, in the end, die. And we can't always just allow for the next 20 years, this person's just going to come and change the rubber gloves every 5 years.
But what you were saying, Sarah, about some artists preferring for your objects to go back to their studios and for them to do the interventions. I mean, that's not conservation, that's remaking, isn't it?
Yeah. Coombs, who is quite famous for, if any of his artwork gets scratched or damaged, he'll want his artwork to be sent back to his studio refinished again. And if any conservator touches his artwork, he'll actually disown it, and he'll say, actually, I didn't create that in the end. You've ruined my artwork, and therefore it has got no value. Wow. So they can actually disown the artwork and say, this is now, it renders your art useless.
I mean, I really want that person to chill out, because I feel like...
That's so interesting. Wow. Because then...
It's so extreme.
It is extreme, but then I suppose maybe the attitude of the artist is part of it.
Well,
waggling my eyebrows at you with Norca. Yeah, theoretical we're being today.
Yeah, you know what? That could in fact be part of it. Yes.
So I would like to sideline from ethics and talk about practicalities.
I'm still giggling internally from bread being considered an accessory.
I just used a word. Okay, I mean accessories to performance art, I suppose.
I get it. But
like a ball of wool isn't the artwork, but it's an accessory to the artwork.
Bread-based accessories. I'm just really enjoying it. Okay, sorry. Okay, I'll grow up now. I'm fine.
I'd just like to know what kind of performance art involves bread.
I mean...
Feeding the pigeons?
I was going to say that there was someone who asked to do a performance-based piece that involved eggs at the art gallery, and they wanted to smash eggs on the floor as part of their performance. So you're not too far off, Kloe, with your bread.
Wow, what an example.
So I have two sides of the practicalities that I'd like to talk about. One is which we've touched on a bit, which is the inherent decayedness of materials and the use of decay as artwork. And the second thing is challenges generally, as in logistical, physical challenges of putting these objects on display. So I don't mind what we talk about first.
Maybe should we pick on the challenges of the display? So I'm just thinking, just from a practicality point of view, the cost of installation for a lot of these modern and contemporary artworks. They're some of them are really expensive on display. So then, are you narrowing it down as to who can actually own these artworks? Because who can display them? Because it costs quite a lot sometimes. So I know that. Well, we did install one piece recently, and it cost about 10 grand to install.
Wow.
Just one piece of artwork, and it took about 9 technicians to install it as well. So that's with expertise in-house. Like, just getting external companies in to come and help us install these works for a 2 to 3 month exhibition as well. So you can see that if a smaller council-run gallery got gifted some of these artworks, they would just never be able to display them.
Yeah, and that's sort of almost elitist, really, isn't it? The idea that in order to be something to be displayed in the way that is required, you'd need to shell out a huge chunk of money. In your mind, do you feel, Sarah, that oversized objects are a specific thing and that the oversizedness is the important aspect of the work?
I think artists now have the capability to make such large things that have such impact, don't they? I think sometimes size is the impact that wants to be the shocking aspect of it, which does take up lots of storage space, which I know all museums and art galleries struggle with. So I know that we have acquired works that don't even fit in our stores. We have to rent external stores just to fit them in other spaces, or they just have to stay on site but not in ideal locations around the building, unfortunately.
One of the things, apart from the difficulties of long-term storage for these things, is also health and safety. And I don't think that's something that's always considered, either by the artists making these things or by the museums collecting them. I'm thinking about things like Mark Quinn's sculptures that are made of frozen blood, for example. So he makes sculptures that are replicas of his head and made out of his own blood, for example. And I think more recently he's been making ones out of blood from refugees and so on. But these are things that have very specific storage requirements in that obviously they have to stay frozen all the time. And in fact, I found a story from The Guardian in about 2002. So about 11 years after this sculpture was made, there was a rumour that Saatchi, who had collected it, had just been keeping it in a domestic freezer. And when he had been having work done on his kitchen, the builders had unplugged the freezer as part of the work and then discovered this kind of trickle of red liquid spreading across the kitchen floor. Now, obviously, he denied this, we should say, and refused to comment on the story. And lots of people said, well, actually, if you had an artwork like that, it would be in its own dedicated freezer and you'd make sure the builders didn't just unplug it or whatever.
Wow.
But these things are very vulnerable to that. But
grim.
a secondary issue to that is that these are things made with human blood, and it is exposing people working in that gallery to any of the risks that come with dealing with human bodily fluids. And is that reasonable?
Absolutely.
And it's not just blood. I mean, people make artworks out of all kinds of things. And so there are potentially risks there. I'm thinking also about Damien Hirst's things that are preserved in formaldehyde.
That sprang to mind as well, yeah.
And I know somebody did actually measure that and just said that there were measurable levels of formaldehyde next to the tanks. And of course, they claimed it wasn't enough to endanger human health. But if you're, say, a gallery attendant who's standing next to this object day in, day out, maybe it would have an effect. I don't know. So
I have an example that I've just remembered about artwork that was essentially, well, it was quite nice, actually. As a concept, I liked it, but I did roll my eyes at like the perfectness of this as something that would cause the conservation problems. It's hilarious. It was iron casts in the shapes of continents filled with salt water. And the idea was that they would evaporate, and this was a comment on climate change. I apologise, I don't remember the name of the artist. I believe it was called Evaporation.
Interesting concept.
Really interesting concept. But of course, they instantly started to corrode. And when I asked about this, they, the part of the thing was, this is the point, it's meant to look like this. But, I did see that there were bits that were particularly thin, and so they would start leaking and they would stop holding water. And what I'm wondering about is, does that changes then the function and the display potential of the artwork? And I don't know, as a conservator, how I would do that, I would work with that. Because the point was to leave salt.
Do we consider that some artworks are just almost like a one-off performance? Like, this can be done so many times and then never again.
What are your thoughts on that, Sarah?
I think, we just have to either talk to the artists and say, will artworks just only last for a set amount of time? Do they have a finite life cycle? And if so, and what does the artist want to do with the artwork that's left? Do then they remake the work, or is that it? Do we just kind of call it an end and say, that's the end of that work? But then what do we do with the work that's still remaining of that piece? So you might have certain continents that have completely vanished, but other bits that are quite intact, for the example that you were giving, Kloe. So what do you do? Do you destroy the rest of the work because part of the work's already gone?
I suppose that's the up to the artist's discretion thing is particularly interesting.
Well, if it were an archaeological pot, then you would make gap fills.
True. Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah.
But then it would have to hold water.
So we've already talked about how there are many interesting types of materials involved in contemporary art conservation, and that's one of many things that I had a chat with Julia Nagle about, actually, and we'll listen to that interview now.
My name's Julia Nagle. I'm a paintings conservator, essentially, but I've, in the last sort of 10, 15 years, specialised much more in modern and contemporary art, and specifically paintings. I qualified in 92 from Newcastle on the easel painting course. I worked for 10 years part-time at Hamilton Car Institute in Cambridge, and part-time sort of building up a private practice, sharing a studio with other conservators in London. And I did that for about 10 years, so that's on much, much older paintings. And then in 2003, 2004, I went to Tate Modern and did maternity cover for the painting conservator there, and then got really sort of into the modern and contemporary from that point on mainly. And then I run my own private studio. So from 2016, I've just been exclusively working in my own practice and building that up. And we've now got sort of 7-8 freelancers who work with us and one permanent member of staff. So we're kind of onwards and upwards with that. So we moved to a studio in Wood Green in North London, and normally sort of working then on more modern paintings from about 1900 onwards.
So it's normally paintings and relatively recent.
Goes right up to the present day, really. I mean, the thing is that we're qualified in paintings, but I think one of the main things with modern artworks is obviously there's an awful lot of mixed media. So, I mean, we've had things on velvet, we've had things on patchwork canvas, we've had dung balls that have been attacked by puppies, we've had all sorts of different... So it can really vary. So sometimes you're just thinking, well, is it a painting or is it to work on paper? Do I need to... So we work closely with other conservators anyway, but, we do often have things that are a total mixture. So we would then be working in a team with other specialists. I don't think there's a kind of normal in a way, but we do, as painting conservators, we're not working on works on paper normally. And if it's sculpture or a mixed media, then we will work with a sculpture conservator or somebody else who knows more about that material. So it's a constant sort of voyage of discovery, really.
That's what I love about conservation, is that it keeps throwing these challenges at you, and you just have to kind of discover new skills and new ways of dealing with things. Exactly. That's right. I think that's a really good point. And, you are doing that with older paintings as well, in the sense that there are lots of decisions to be made about, what's restoration, what's not, what's original, what's supposed to be cleaned off. It might be many, many different things. So there are always these kind of problems to solve. But I particularly really like the problem-solving side of contemporary and modern works, definitely, and the sort of massive variety of materials and techniques that
that you've got. It's undeniably kind of a wider range than it is with older paintings, for sure.
I mean, you've already kind of widened my look on this subject a bit, because when I think modern art, then I think, people are using acrylics instead of oils, and I bet that's a nightmare to deal with. But maybe I'm entirely wrong about that. Maybe acrylics are quite nice to work with.
Do you know what? They are quite nice. They are actually quite good, because there is also a lot of research, fortunately, that's gone into acrylics and how to clean them. I mean, you're absolutely right in the sense that they're very different. They behave really differently from oil paints. So, for example, like if you're cleaning dirt off an acrylic painting, you really don't generally want to be using deionized water. And that would actually really potentially drive dirt into paint film and things. So it's really different. So I think you've got to understand that you are dealing with a different material and act accordingly and sort of know your materials and things. But there is Tate did a really big project, and it's Tate and That's Art. They did a big project into cleaning modern paints. And then now, of course, there's the whole sort of CAPS, cleaning acrylic painted surfaces workshops that are going around and sort of tour the world, and run by the Getty and Tate and National Gallery in Washington and places. So there's a lot of research, fortunately, that's gone into all of this over the last few years, which is enormously helpful. So there is quite a lot of information out there. But yeah, you really do, you need to treat them differently. They behave differently. They're made up different materials. So it is important. But there are so many other things, like we've had a mirrored surface, like literally silver mirrored surface on a canvas. What else? We've got quite a lot of metallics and things, actually. And also... so that the paints themselves are really different, and then you've also got things like metal, maybe moving parts, or I don't know, somebody like John Layton might use books, found books and metal and wire and rust and silicon, and so there's just an awful lot of different things. So even with paintings, we've got paintings with kind of foam sponges as part of them, or
oh my gosh.
So we have got somebody who works with us who specialises in modern materials, and she specialises in plastics. She's been doing this, Corinne van Albel, she's been doing research into plastics and how to even identify them. But since she came to us, amazingly, we've got tons of plastics. Like we've got one painting downstairs made of reflector fabric. But it's not really a painting. It just looks like a painting because it's kind of fabric stretched on wood. So, generally speaking, I still say a lot of it is painting.
Yeah.
And they are still paintings, but there are also other things that definitely come in, resins, all sorts of different things.
What would you say the biggest challenges of working with modern media are?
Apart from just the massive variety and knowing, when you need to get somebody else's advice or whatever, which is common, I'd say in terms of, if we're just talking about the paintings, is the solubility, which is completely different from older paintings. So if you're used to working on older paintings, we quite often can't use white spirit anywhere near a painting, or D40 or anything like that. You've got to go to maybe Shell Salty and aliphatic or something. You can't. They're very, very soluble. Or soluble in very different solvents. And so that, not only for cleaning, but that really makes a difference when you're trying to do reversible retouching. That can make a big difference. So we sort of feed off people like maybe paper conservators who have to work on a much more porous surface. So we're not dealing with a varnished paint film normally, and that makes quite a big difference. So if we're cleaning directly onto that paint film as well, rather than having any kind of varnish as a barrier. Yeah. If we're surface cleaning off dirt. Looking at the objects conservation side of things, we tend to use acrylics precisely, to retouch things on the basis that it's different from the paint that's already on it. But of course, that doesn't apply when the original substrate is acrylic. Exactly. And then also, a lot of the things like, I don't know, paraloid, for example, B72, which painters, conservators working on older paintings would quite often use as a really good material. That would dissolve most of the paintings that we go anywhere near. You can't use it. So, so it makes that very different. We very often working with sort of water-based retouching, or even sometimes dry pigment, or very much less bound things. And also the sort of gloss as well that we're trying. It's really challenging finding things that don't just make stuff shiny. Yeah. The surfaces are really important, often, quite sort of matte surfaces or even shiny surfaces, but the sort of pristine surface is quite an important part of many modern works, isn't it? So surfaces, I suppose, are generally probably a lot more fragile in a way than some of the older paintings that might have had a varnish or whatever. But then on the other hand, things like canvas are quite nice and flexible because they're still young and youthful, so they're still quite elastic.
Yeah.
So if you've got dents and things like that in them, they're often a bit easier because they're not set in their ways like old canvases.
Yeah.
They're not as stiff. And they haven't necessarily been interfered with by conservators in the past. So
oh, yeah. You're the first people to properly, interfere.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really big responsibility.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
Something we take very seriously because, you don't want to set something off on a kind of restoration journey for the rest of its life, having to have these sort of processes reversed or anything. But, you do have in your head, right, okay, how many paintings have I seen where I kind of think, would have been better if the conservator hadn't done that. But also, it does mean that actually often what you're looking at is the original artwork, at least. It's a bit less complicated on that front.
Is there a particular material that gives you more headaches than any other?
I would say not something that artists use, but the thing that gives us more headaches than anything else is poor handling.
Yeah.
And wrapping. I mean, in the past, people aren't using so much bubble, I don't think now, but wrapping materials stuck to slightly sticky modern paintings where they haven't fully dried.
Oh.
That is my bête noire, really, I'd say. And then also, I suppose, people just handling things so that they crack. Because, if you've got a flat paint surface and it's got a crack in it, a flat colour will just not, there's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to disguise things. So I suppose, irreversible damage being done through sort of just poor handling or poor packing is really sad.
Yeah.
I suppose one of the things that we've got quite a lot coming up now is people from the sort of 70s, 80s using alkyd primers where they're really brittle. That's a big, cracks in modern paintings. But I don't think there is a particular sort of material because honestly they vary such a lot anyway.
Yeah.
And also we quite like the fact that artists use all these different materials somehow. That keeps it really entertaining, like you said.
Yeah.
Really varied. So I think in a way the artists probably most of the time are okay with what they're doing. It's just the way that they're then handled when they leave the studio.
What advice would you give to conservators out there who are glancing worriedly at their modern art?
I would say, with all of these things, they're all problems that need solving, aren't they? So you need to break down any problem into bite-sized pieces, I would say. Just the same as with anything. I think if you are really worried about your modern art, you maybe don't have quite enough experience yet. You may think, I need to call somebody who perhaps does have a bit more experience or get some experience at a studio or a gallery where you get to work on some because, they are a bit different. And I think it's important for all of us to understand our own limits, isn't it?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
if you really are worried, then, I think as with anything else, if you're worried, you need to unpack that problem and you need to perhaps get advice from somebody else as well.
I think that's solid advice for anyone out there, really, on many levels. And there's no shame in asking for help or advice. Ever.
Oh, completely. No, exactly right. I think as well, I would say, there's loads of stuff. If you're working with modern art and contemporary art, there's tons of artist interviews online. there's so much you can do, but just by looking online and sort of finding out a bit more about what's meant to be there, what isn't. The other thing I would say probably is that it's really difficult sometimes to test on modern paintings. There's not really anywhere to hide and anywhere to do tests and things. So you sometimes have to try to make mock-ups, which obviously is sort of, a bit limited in terms of having identical reactions on a mock-up to an original painting. We've worked with artists where they've actually given us samples of bits of paintings
fabulous.
And things. Yeah, really useful. So that can sometimes happen as well.
Do you have any advice for people out there who'd like to pursue a career in modern art conservation?
I think it's not that easy in Britain, is it, to find actual sort of training courses for that?
No.
I mean, I would say really sort of develop your problem-solving skills, definitely. Personally, I think it's really great if you've worked in different places and you've built up a bit of a network, because I don't know that anyway in conservation everybody can do every part of it brilliantly all the time in isolation. I never really felt like that, but I think especially with modern things, they are so diverse. It's brilliant. The more you've got a kind of community and people that you can just refer to, ask for help or whatever, that's really great. And I think you build that up sometimes going to conferences and being part of that, but also potentially there's a lot of freelance work out there, isn't there? And I think you can get work in different places and just sort of get informed. Don't be afraid to collaborate. I think definitely that. I think you do need, personally as a paintings conservator, I think that paper conservation is really interesting. But I just think kind of the way that they work in, I mean, certainly for sort of cleaning, retouching and not being able to kind of, just have to be super careful of your surface and not disrupting it. And oh yes, I suppose the other thing is to realise that you're going to, a large part of any project that you do probably be spent on testing your own techniques and methods, and then problem solving and all the research and everything, and not so much time on interacting, because in a way, you know, you have to be really, I think, really reticent about intervention. You do try to, I think, you know, less is more, because you might be retouching something that's still changing. People don't like, restoration is quite a dirty word in the sort of contemporary art market as well. It's really funny, it's really frowned upon. So if you're really sort of into a lot of painting and a lot of interacting with things, it might also be quite frustrating.
So it's almost more for the experimental and problem-solving person.
I think so. And possibly, I would say possibly the sociable person, because I think it is something, I kind of think it does demand a bit of interact. That's just my personal opinion. I probably feel like that generally about conservation, so maybe that's not so relevant.
So finally, what's the best thing about working on contemporary art?
The colour, the massively colourful studio full of vibrant and happy paintings, you know, rather than...
love it.
The fact that it's quite...
it's not brown.
It's not brown, and it's not a man in wig and tights. Not a portrait of a man in wig and tie. You've got the living artist, which is really exciting. It's constantly throwing up new challenges. It's not smelly or solventy, because you can't generally use any solvent. So that's quite nice. The studio is not smelly. It's also quite good in the sense, and a slightly more boring way, I suppose, but you can do preventive things that actually, you can catch things before they're damaged. So we do a lot of insert backboards and things like that on modern paintings that aren't framed and they're not protected in that way. So, and you feel like, well, that's actually quite meaningful at this point, because you're able, with the knowledge that we've got, you can actually help to prevent damage. You know, before it's too late.
Early intervention.
And it's never boring. I don't think it's ever boring. Oh, and they're subversive generally. I quite like the fact that you've got a lot of art that's made, you know, it's not commissioned by the church or the royal family.
Thank you so much for talking to us today, Julia. That was fabulous to hear.
I absolutely loved it when she said it's not all men in wigs and breeches, and that it's very colourful.
That was great. I did love that.
And also her point about it being a much nicer environment to work in, because paintings conservators use a lot of solvents, and they're often using mixtures of quite toxic solvents as well. So
I thought that was really interesting.
To be forced not to use that is brilliant.
Interesting aspects, definitely.
The thing that I found most interesting was the poor handling element, because I'm obviously we're all used to working with old stuff. The newness of materials can cause problems, and I was really, really interested in the amount of damage that can be caused by just handling something badly.
I also really enjoyed what Julia was saying about the responsibility of being the very first person to carry out any intervention on these objects.
It's funny because...
both the responsibility of that and also the joy of not having loads of previous generations of conservators come along and kind of it up with treatments that are then difficult to undo. So
it kind of harks back to our wet stuff episode where... people were also talking about the immense responsibility of like making such a massive intervention, being for contemporary art being the first one, and for waterlogged materials to be the kind of definitive one that ensures any kind of preservation, which is kind of crazy. So it's kind of funny how it all comes around to the immense pressure we're under sometimes.
No sweat, everything's fine.
Everything's fine. Nobody's dying. Everything's fine.
But we should be paid more.
But we should definitely be paid more.
I'm amazed that we haven't mentioned that in this series yet, actually.
Pay us more. Done.
Tick.
I was just going to say something that I thought of before when you were introducing was of an artwork that I've been working on recently, which is by a contemporary artist that we just acquired, and it was by an artist called Barry Finnan, who's not a very well-known artist, quite local to Manchester, but he uses Posca pen. Have you heard of them? They're like basically like a felt tip tip pen that you get in art shops.
Yeah.
And so he's used a lot of those on like canvases, and so we attach them just onto canvases. But he doesn't like the use of stretches either. But Posca pens have got no light fastness at all, and they fade so fast in the light. So it's then that artwork, even though it's brand new, it's the fragility of it again that it's just not going to last.
Wow.
Chloe was laughing at my face then because I use quite a lot of these pens.
So now you'll be like, oh,
I just keep those in the dark.
Them.
It's fine.
They're preserved digitally. It's fine.
Okay, carry on.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so I did some light tests on them. So yes, and they last for if you put them in an exhibition at 200 lux, they last for under a year. Like
That's amazing.
Sensitive. It's unbelievable.
Wow.
When you say last, how much damage do you see?
It's considerable fading and colour change.
Wow.
Oh, that's a harsh
That's
life.
so interesting.
So on the topic of what artists use, years ago I had this really great conversation with a conservator who does a lot of training courses, and she pitched this idea that maybe we should run workshops for artists and crafters and, you know, people who create things, and teach them about what materials are likely to last and how they can test if something is likely to last, such as leave it out in the sun for a bit, or, you know, put it in your oven, you know, just like do basic testing themselves, or pick things that either deteriorate quickly because that's what they want to achieve, or things that last for a long time because that's what they want to achieve. That you could teach people who are creative about the different material choices.
So I work with someone who does do that kind of outreach with quilters in particular, because people who are making these quilts, obviously a huge amount of labour goes into making them, and they're often intended as heirloom items. And so my colleague, she's run a couple of workshops, I think, with quilters, talking to them about the kinds of selection of materials and the polyester batting and all that kind of things that might degrade, and how they can make choices that will ensure that their quilts will last longer.
That's so cool. So I'm glad to hear someone's doing that.
Yeah.
I still think it's a really good idea. So if anyone else out there is talking to people about what materials they can use for you know, for whatever purpose that they want, if they want it to degrade quickly or they want it to last forever, you know, like I would love to hear about it, because I think that's really interesting.
Definitely.
And a great conversation to have with a creative community.
I was just going to say, I found a website that do light fastness tests and things on some modern materials that you can find in art stores. So I'll send you the link and you can pop it on the bottom of this.
That's brilliant.
Please.
Brilliant.
So in terms of training, Sarah, what have you found? Because obviously you started as objects and you've specialised in a way into this. What have you found available to specialise and to learn and study?
So there are a few networks around and a few groups. So there's an icon group that's just started up quite recently. There's the INCA as well. They're the International Works for the Conserving of Contemporary Arts, based predominantly over in the States, but they've got quite a lot of resources on their website as well, which is very useful. And there's quite a big network over in the Netherlands as well for Europe.
And there's also things like the Modern Materials Conservation, Plastics Conservation at Westdean, and there's the, I believe you're going to a conference.
Yeah, I'm going to this Maastricht conference soon, and that's like a workshop on contemporary materials.
There's also the NACCA, New Approaches in the Conservation of Contemporary Art, and I believe they've just had a conference. And they seem to have talked about loads and loads of different things. And we've actually got Anthi, who's recorded something about that for us later on. So, Sarah, you mentioned about the contemporary art group at Icon. I've been able to speak to Anne French, who is a member of the Contemporary Art Network. I'm here with Anne French to talk about her experience as a contemporary art conservator. Hi, Anne.
Hello.
Anne, could you first tell us a bit about yourself and how that's led to your involvement with contemporary art?
First, I should say that I never expected to ever have to work with contemporary art. I started my training and my career in working with, expecting to work with historic textiles for the whole of my life. And it was only really when I got a position here at the Whitworth Art Gallery, which has one of the leading collections of contemporary art in the UK, that I had to grapple with what it meant to me as a conservator, and whether I had to change how I worked and what I worked with.
So how has your background in textiles conservation, how has that helped or impacted with your career and your understanding of contemporary art conservation?
What I'd say is, especially as a textile conservator, and for one of my posts as an area museum council conservator, where I had to cover textiles of every kind, whether it was the back of a TV, to a banner, to a christening robe, to a sampler, to a piece of dress, to firemen's uniforms, is that we have such a wide range of materials to deal with historically and now, in terms of material and in terms of scale.
Yeah.
And it makes you problem solvers. You can't not think laterally and sideways as a textile conservator, and that has enabled me to appreciate a load of the problems that come with contemporary art.
So it's a fairly new discipline that we're developing, and there's various things going on around the world that we'll talk about later. Do you see any obstacles to development in the discipline in this country?
I think contemporary art is... People tend not to have certain kinds of... Well, what is contemporary art? Which is a huge, wide and philosophical question, which I'm not going to go into. Yes. But in terms of institutions like ourselves here at the Whitworth, Manchester Art Gallery, the Tate and other places, it's the term given to a kind of art based on materials, very installation-based, very multimedia, often performative, which is bringing in display items that you probably wouldn't have at home. I would exclude here sort of people who are still working in traditional print, weaving and embroidery forms, and there are plenty of those. What I think we're looking at is the kind of installations and time-based media material that we've had here at the Whitworth and have had to put on. What's different about it, I think, is that it is being displayed.
Right.
When I started at the Victoria and Albert Museum in my training, contemporary art was barely displayed. We are now expected to display it and put it on and look after it, which didn't happen before. And I think that's one of the things for me that has really changed, that you go into the great national institutions and there are things that are made now on display in front of you. Well, that didn't happen years ago. So we have to look after it, and we have to display it, and we have to learn how it's made. And we often have to make it for the artists. I mean, we are given a brief which we then have to construct. It is also the art of now. It hasn't had a chance to decay, whereas we all know that we work with the survivors from the historic periods, and there is a lot that has not survived.
Of course.
And we are now expecting that the installation that we put in to a gallery, that is all going to be kept and is capable of being, of surviving. And that's probably not the case, but we're trying very hard to do it. The way to do it, I think, is it isn't an isolated discipline, and it calls upon all of us and all our skills. You are looking at every single conservator, wherever you train, whatever you train to work with, you will have an input into contemporary art, because the large installations have everything from textiles to plastics to metal to pottery to works of art on paper to painted surfaces to wood, and we all have to contribute. The only specialism, I would say, is the time-based media in the film and photographic elements, and that sort of reflects a traditional discipline, but they all come together in an installation. And you also have to work with audiovisual technicians, riggers, sound technicians, musicians, all sorts, and sometimes the art is painted directly onto the wall by the artist's studio. So what is fascinating about it is the range of people that you end up working with, and all contribute to what makes a contemporary arts installation. It's not something you can just sit at a bench and work on anymore.
No, it's a vast collaboration then.
It is vast collaboration, absolutely.
So what do you see as the challenges of this collaboration then?
I see two forms of challenges, really. One, I think those of us who work with contemporary art tend to work for institutions. So I think it's rarer for people in the private sector to encounter this material. Therefore, it's just harder to appreciate what it involves. And for those of us who do work in the public sector institutions who are displaying and acquiring and storing this material, It's finding the opportunities when one's a busy conservator to learn from others. And this is, for me, where, there are roles for conferences, workshops, just going and working somewhere else, doing placements, couriering an object where you can see something being installed by others and you can always learn from that. So the challenge is, those of us who do have some experience, is how to best disseminate it and how to disseminate it. And it's not, for me, just a traditional conference. It has to be wider than that.
Right.
And of course, these days, there's always the challenge of cost for anyone. So can you take time out of work? Can your employer afford to let you go somewhere for a conference, to a placement or whatever? So we need to find ways to share better. And I know ICON is starting a network for contemporary art conservation, but it's early days yet and it's still finding its feet. But I think we need feedback from the wider sector to know what's really needed by those people who aren't doing it every day.
So we've just seen, probably on social media, many of us have seen the NACCA meetings, the new approaches to the conservation of contemporary art meetings in Maastricht. You mentioned the Contemporary Art Network. Is that one of the main ways then you feel we can collaborate worldwide? There seems to be quite a lot going on in the discipline in the rest of Europe.
I think Europe has definitely got a head start on the UK in terms of disseminating information. I wonder personally whether that's a reflection of the lack of conservators in institutions in this country with contemporary art. And I think fewer of our institutions have, until recently, acquired contemporary art. It tends to be the larger ones. So how do we, probably not at the moment, given what's going on in the UK, to wonder how we're going to work with Europe. But I do know that I went to a lot of conferences to start with when I first came to the Whitworth, and it was really useful for me to see where to look for information and to whom to approach for information, because it was clear that there are certain organisations and people who have a wealth of information and experience to call upon, and I've received nothing but generosity when consulting them. So we do need to find a way of disseminating information, and I think it's something all the groups in ICON probably need to grapple with, because personally I make a distinction between modern materials and contemporary art.
Yes.
It's every single discipline in conservation has to get to grips with modern materials, but possibly not everyone is going to have to get to grips with contemporary art. And I think a lot of the issues that seem to come up with contemporary art we should be doing as conservators anyway, which is the team working, the collaboration, the research, especially the consultation, because although in contemporary art it is almost a prerequisite that you consult the artist, well, surely we should be doing that for everything that we work on. Whether you're consulting an expert in the field or the cultural community from whom the work you are working on originates, that applies whatever. Contemporary art is not unique here. So I think all of conservation can learn from some of the experiences of people who've been working with contemporary arts in terms of communication skills, communication, documentation, and just general attitude to problem solving that it forces on you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anne, for speaking to the C Word. That was really, really interesting.
Not at all.
Hello everyone, my name is Anthi Soulioti and I'm an objects conservator. I have worked primarily in archival, paper-based collections around London, but I have a deep and long-standing interest in the conservation of contemporary art, which derives from my fascination in the properties and deterioration of plastics and the ethical challenges with regards to their conservation. It is fair to say that there's plenty of opportunities to get challenged in contemporary art. So today marks a month, more or less, that I've had attending talks, conferences and workshops related to this issue. First was the West End Plastic Seminar I did with Kloe, which was informative, exciting and fun. Then I went to Vanishing Point, which was a virtual reality preservation day conference at Central St. Martin's. This opened a completely brand new can of worms, but it was thoroughly enjoyable. I found the willingness of the participants from the different institutions to collaborate and find solutions to the common dangers VR preservation presents very encouraging. You'll be able to find most of the talks and panel discussions online. Fast forward to the last event called The Lives of Net Art and held at the Tate Modern from the 3rd to the 4th of April. Very similar to the previously mentioned VR conference, yet another mind-bending experience focused on the preservation of born digital artworks. Very interesting talks from curators, artists and conservators alongside various workshops. I had a couple of amazing conversations with some well-experienced people on how to define what we need to preserve. Is it the software, the hardware, only the idea, or all of the above? What is authenticity and where does artists' intent lie according to different people? Because, it's not a universally and mutually accepted concept. How are museums and galleries evolving through the changes of the nature of the artworks? I have to mention one very interesting point was made by the Whitney Museum's curator Christiane Paul, which was regarding the distinction between the perception of digital artworks by people born before and people born after the digital era, with the younger generations blurring the boundaries between digital and physical reality much more effortless. All in all, it was a great experience. Last but by far not least, the NACA conference, which happened in Maastricht in the end of March. It was a 4-day event showcasing the developments done in the field by the members of the training and research program called New Approaches in the Conservation of Contemporary Art. It involved a solid quality of presentations by the PhD students and a variety of keynote speakers from theorists and professors to philosophers and lawyers. Because if you think that the contemporary art's relationship with legal issues such as authorship, ownership, and authenticity are straightforward, well, think again. The talks were recorded and hopefully will be uploaded at the NACA's website very soon. For now, you can find the presentation abstracts on the website. Although it was fairly small, just under 150 people, so not intense at all, it was so overwhelmingly packed with new information, ideas, and ethical challenges. Therefore, it was by far the most thought-provoking experience I've had so far. I also got to ask Vivian van Saaze, one of the NACA organizers, some questions regarding the program and the conference. I do apologize for the background noise, and you will also have to excuse my nervousness because I'm fairly inexperienced in interviewing, let alone a legend like Vivian. That said, I hope you enjoy the interview. So I'm sitting here with Dr. Vivian van Saaze, Assistant Professor at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the Maastricht University and the Director of its Resource Center on Arts and Heritage, MAH. One of the main driving forces behind NACA, the New Approaches in the Conservation of Contemporary Art, both as a PhD candidate supervisor and as an organizer. So thank you very much for joining me today. What were the main goals of this program when it started?
So it must have been, I guess, about 5 years ago, or maybe even 6 years ago, when René van der Val, who was a professor at the same faculty, and I were working on actually several research projects, but it really has been a long trajectory of about 10 years or so with different projects that eventually led to this larger Marie Curie ITN, which is an initial training program. So it started with several research projects involving lots of partners, also some PhD projects on contemporary art conservation. And at some point we received funding from the Dutch government to establish a network, an international network. And that international network allowed us to develop this larger European proposal project on contemporary art conservation, which really at that point, so that must be about 5 years ago, it really felt that the field was expanding, but there were also so many questions still needed to be answered, and this training program seemed like a really nice format to be able to address those questions, but also to train a new cohort of people who would be able to address those questions and who could also cross the bridge or build bridges between academia and professions and work in museums or either in universities, and who could speak to curators and to conservators. So it's really this idea of within the shifting field we need, and maybe not so much new, but
innovative.
Yeah, innovative people who have this capacity or who are trained also in such a way that they can build these bridges within conservation of contemporary art specifically. And that's what the Marie Curie ITN proposal allowed to do, to have 15 PhD candidates across Europe, some based at universities, some based at museums, but always within this museum practice. So very close to museum practices.
Lovely. How have the meetings and conferences like the one today seemed to be set to achieve these goals that you just described?
I don't know whether we've achieved the goals. I think we've established a lot, but it's maybe also too soon to tell whether we've been able to achieve the goals. But so the Marie Curie ITN is really about training a generation within Europe that is able to kind of cross geographical borders, speak to each other, but also disciplinary borders, right? So, and we developed a training program together with all the other partners and the beneficiaries in the project, which consisted of several winter and summer schools and also conferences. Having all these conversations with each other and expanding it and inviting other people. So in that sense, I think we've hopefully achieved our goals, in the sense that there is now a real community of PhD candidates, as well as their supervisors and all the other people who are here with us over the past few days, or at other meetings that we had, and we're also kind of part of those conversations that we had. So,
with the program coming to a conclusion, as you mentioned, how do you feel that the initial goals have been developed?
I think when we started, I'm talking from my own perspective, but couldn't have imagined that it would be such a community, and that the kind of relationships that they've established among themselves, it's quite extraordinary. But you could also tell, and that's maybe also specific for a particular generation, that for them it was really important to establish these networks. So from the start, most of them were really outgoing and going to conference, and we, as a supervisor, I also sometimes said, no, please, no conferences anymore, no traveling.
Slow down.
Focus on your research. And you have to write a PhD, and that needs concentration and time to think and time to change your ideas. And so all these conferences and all this traveling, I mean, of course, that's also important, but within a 3-year period, which is, ridiculous. At least in the Netherlands, a PhD is at least 4 years. So 3 years is really, really short to do such innovative research also.
And thorough.
Yes. So I think that was also a challenge, but it's not. It hasn't ended, right? I mean, it feels like it's a momentum today, and this conference is a momentum, but they will continue, and we will continue, and these dissertations, a lot of them still have to be finished. So, so there's still work to do. Yeah.
Okay, so since things seem to be continuing, what do you think the future holds for these people, for the collaborators, and for the future of research in contemporary art?
Yeah.
Maybe similar initiatives happening sometime soon?
Yeah. I don't quite know. I think, again, it's too soon. I mean, we are thinking within the pool and also within MAG. It's an interdisciplinary and interfaculty research center, so there are different faculties involved, like the law faculty and the School of Business and Economics. And we had one panel today which also addressed legal issues and tried also to bring in the art market and stakeholders like estates, right? So that was really, for me, that was one of the panels that I thought, I think this is many of the topics addressed within that panel. I could consider that to be future research, because I think that's where those are the topics that we maybe couldn't address 10 years ago within the conservation of contemporary arts field, because there were other priorities. But at this point, I think we can now address, and we should address these questions and try to build bridges again between these worlds which are not separated from each other. Arts or conservation, the art market, they're very much intertwined, but we hardly talk about it, at least not in a kind of public or academic
open way.
And I feel that that's where, at least for me also, that's an interesting field to explore further. And I spoke to, of course, many of the ESRs, the early stage researchers, and some of them have already found new jobs or have been contacted, and I just really think that this network will stay as a network, right? I mean, they will see each other, and we will have more conferences. And
I'm sure it will expand.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a start for them. And I think also the SPMK in the Netherlands, and together with INCA, I think they're already planning a next conference in 2 or 3 years. So, and of course we have ICOM, and so there are so many of these shared conferences where I'm sure we'll meet again, right?
Well, I'm very much looking forward to the next conferences. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In the second week of March 2019, I was lucky enough to go to the West Dean Plastics Conservation short course with Yvonne Shashua. That's right, the Hogwarts of conservation and the queen of plastics in museum collections. It's fair to say that this review is going to be overwhelmingly positive, so it's not so much a review as a brief description and some top tips. I attended as full board, which is £750 for a 3-day course. You can save some money by staying elsewhere, but if you'll need to get funding for £500, which is the course fee, you may as well get the full amount and enjoy the full experience. It kicks off before dinner with a sort of meet and greet, which is a good setup for the nervous or shy, because it gives you some time to get used to your new colleagues in an intro to the historical development of plastics to set you up for the week. They're long days from 9 to 7, but the topics are so varied and the individual sessions so well tailored that you're getting an intellectual workout without meeting the saturation point of your brains. We were all sent the notes in the form of lecture slides, and I would advise printing them for making additional notes. Yvonne is extremely knowledgeable and deeply interested in the topic, so she squeezes in a huge amount of information, scientific and relating to museum collections. Don't be put off if you're not a scientist, though. Yvonne is very funny and patient. She uses relatable examples and visual descriptions to help you understand and remember. It's also quite repetitive, in a really good way. Each new section supports and references the last, so that you're encouraged to make connections and form memories. That's how my brain works, at least, and it really worked. And let's face it, most of us interested in plastics conservation are interested because of the experiences we've had and the problems we have to find solutions for. I love this community. Everyone I studied with was so interested and supportive and generous with experiences and stories and advice. Some special features of the course included a field trip to a plastics factory where we were shown some of the processes that leave diagnostic indicators on the objects, like extrusion, for example. Brenda Canagan and Janneke Langveld were guest speakers, which was brilliant as they gave different perspectives on the problems facing museums. Brenda described her work in the identification of plastics and the development of a sort of danger list of the really problematic materials to either take action with or avoid altogether. Janneke presented a number of fascinating case studies of plastics in the Science Museum collections, which were really eye-opening to the unexpected problems even a small amount of plastics can cause, like the wiring in an electrically powered doll's house, for example. In such a big museum as well, if something is melting on display, for example, the problem is expected to be solved, so pragmatic decision-making is really significant here. It's not just lectures and trips. For the practical learners, there were several open practical sessions that gave us a chance to touch and feel and think about the characteristics for identification and the potentials for treatment. It's worth noting that this is such a new and experimental discipline that there is no way to conserve plastics. You won't be taught a list of treatments to perfect that will solve all your problems. What you are taught, however, is the beginnings of how to respond to the problems of plastics deterioration, how to think about them as a discipline, as distinct as the others. There are no rules yet, and methods that are only just forming. We were taught foundations of these and encouraged to experiment. We were also introduced to the results of studies carried out by Yvonne and others on the cleaning of different types of plastics. And of course, and this is very important to me, the storage methods for different forms of plastics that will give them the best chance of survival for future display. What more can I say? This is a growing discipline in our profession, and Yvonne Shishore is at the forefront of it. And as a polymer scientist, she is perfectly suited to taking us back to our roots, getting a handle on what the materials are doing, and developing solutions from there. It isn't easy, but it's so exciting.
Okay, guys, that was a great talk. I feel like we covered a lot of ground.
We covered so much ground. I feel like contemporary art conservation is becoming more and more in the presence of our minds in the profession. And that's so positive because there are other parts of the world that are doing so many great things, like in the Netherlands, as you just said. Plastics research as well.
I think something to remember is that maybe we need to take the scariness out of contemporary art because there's going to be a lot more of it because we are moving forward in time.
Yes.
And art will continue to be produced
Yes.
and will continue to come into our museums and it will be glorious and we should love it, sponges and all.
Maybe not sponges.
Maybe not sponges. Right. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
If you're enjoying the C Word and would like to support our work, then please consider becoming one of our patrons. For as little as $1 per month, you can help us keep our episodes online and more of them coming. Patreon helps us meet our regular costs for the show, and also to plan ahead so we know roughly how much of a monthly budget we've got. That's super helpful when you're trying to do something special like buy a better microphone or save up to go to a special event. Your support also helps keep us free of advertisement. In return, our supporters get access to our archive of extended episodes, which you can only access on our Patreon page. Yeah, for that $1 a month, you get a little extra audio enjoyment. We've crunched the numbers, and it's about 10% extra content on a regular basis. Well, that's not bad for less than a cup of coffee, eh? If supporting us sounds like something you'd like to do, then head over to patreon.com/thecword and join our bunch of absolute champions. Thanks for listening. With the C Word, and you've been listening to Sarah Potter, Chloe Ramsey, Christina Rosaic, and me, Jenny Mathiasen. Join us next time for an episode about working with communities. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at the C Word Podcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by Didi Missick, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production. Maybe just give it a moment.
Yeah, interlude.
More lift music.
Christina! Christina left.
What?